Today we're going to be making a couple of feather boards. We're going to continue with our table saw series and how to keep you safe and help prevent kickback in a table saw. I'm going to be using a piece of 1x leftover pine material from a job. It's got a couple of drill holes in it and a couple of screw holes in it, but I'll be able to work around them and make these feather boards. So I'm going to do two of them, one that I'll be able to clamp to the table, and then one that I'm going to be able to clamp to my sacrificial fence in order to help hold the material down. So, and we'll get into that a little bit and why you would need that. I did a little bit before, but as I do these feather boards, we'll talk about that some more. Hi everybody, I'm Jim Deerdorf and this is Detroit DIY. Let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is just cut me off 10 inches of this 1x. I have two cut at 10 inches. Now you can use a 1x6. A 1x6 is probably the preferable choice to use. I'm not sure what this started life as because it got ripped down a little bit on one side to fit into the area that it was in before. So like I say, this is just a removable piece of material that I've decided to bring out here and make some feather blocks out of. So what I want to do now is cut a 20-degree angle on one side. I'm going to use my miter gauge in the T-slot on my table saw, or the miter slot on my table saw, to go ahead and cut those two 20-degree angles. And the angle doesn't really matter. You can cut it at 20. In fact, when I'm finished, I may even adjust it, or before I cut the fingers in the boards, I may even adjust the angle, depending on how once I cut it and how I see when it sits on the slot, what it looks like when it's all the way back in front of the blade. So I've got my 20-degree angle cut on my board right here. And now what I want to do is set it in here so that it's in front of the blade. Let me raise the blade up just a little bit so we can see that better. So you want to make sure that when your feather board is mounted to your saw that it's behind the blade. You don't want it to be up against the side of the blade or into this part where you're pushing on the wood that's already been cut. You need to push on the wood that's not been cut. So what I like to do is make these feather boards so that I can use them on the largest piece of wood possible. And the last one that I made was just a little bit too wide and had just a little bit of issue. So, and it may have been angle issue more than width. So I'm going to take a look at this. And as you can see, it is hanging over the edge of the saw right here. So if I was to just change the angle slightly, this would be a better board for me. And I think I'm going to narrow it up just a little bit also. I'm going to do that with both of them. This is my 20-degree angle and it's sitting pretty close with the blade. I'm not perfect right now and I'm not sweating that too much. But what I am is this right here. So I've made a little pencil mark at the edge of my table right here. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and narrow both of my feather boards up by that much. So once you get them cut and you set them on there, so if I were to increase the angle, that would only make it worse. And I really don't want to go any less than a 20-degree angle. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut that little bit off, and then we'll go from there. What I'm going to do now is measure down 3 inches from here and 3 inches from here, and then scribe me a line on this 20-degree angle. Should go about right over that little hole that's in it right there, and that will be the length of my fingers. So the fingers for the feather board will be 3 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and get that line across, and then we're going to start laying out where to cut our slots for our screws, and we'll get into that in a second. So now I've got my combination square set at 1 inch. So I just want to set it on here and scribe me a line at the top and at the bottom on both sides marking that 1 inch. Now that I've got the 1 inch lines on here, I've got my combination square set at a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. All 4 sides will get marked out at 1/2 inch. I've got all those lines scribed on. Nothing's connected yet, but they will be. So what I want to do now is just come off of the back side, the flat side here, and I want to mark it up 3/4 of an inch to the 1/2 inch line. Just like that. That's where I'm going to drill the hole to use the bolts to hold it in place, and we'll get those out in a minute and talk about them. So I'm going to do the same thing over here, and I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm not worried about it being perfect, and I may adjust these down just a little bit if I need to, but I want them very close to the ends. So, and this will not be 3/4 away, and I'm fine with that, because the closer you can get the slots here on this side, the better off you are where the feathers are going to be. And I'll show you how we're going to relieve that and make it better. I've connected all the lines down to where I need to. So the area right here, this is going to be where the feathers are going to be, or the fingers. I'm going to take my jigsaw, I just kind of rough sketched this on here. I'm going to take my jigsaw and cut this out so that these portions of the wood cannot contact what the feathers are contacting. In fact, I'll probably take this one to the inside of the line or bring it down just a little bit more so that I don't have to worry about any contact there. Then what I did was set this angle finder just to the 20 degrees that I cut at the top of the board. I pulled it down to the location of the hole that I was the happiest with, and just scribe the other side. So that'll be where I'll drill the 2 1/4 inch holes, and we will do that shortly. I'm going to go ahead now and cut the fingers. I'm going to cut my first cut right along this line. Then I'm going to move over 1 blade width and cut that out so that I have a little clearance between the first finger and this piece of material that I'm leaving. The reason I'm leaving this is so that I have more adjustment. I can fit a wider board in and still use the feather board. What you'll wind up with is about a gap this wide. And then the reason we raised the saw blade up all the way is for the undercut. So you can see it cut a little further back on the back side of the board, but that's no big deal. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to this side. Now that that's complete, I'll go ahead and start just cutting in the feathers, and I'm just going to eyeball it. I want them to be approximately 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch wide. So it's just going to be eyeballed, probably 10 feathers or so in here, 10 fingers. So there we have it. Some of the fingers are a little narrow, some of them are a little wider. It doesn't matter. They're plenty stout and they're going to do the job. And as a team, they'll even do it better. So we're going to go ahead and get the jigsaw out and get these cut out. I'm going to use a drill bit one size larger than a 1/4 inch, and I'm going to drill a hole here, one right here, and one here. It's all finished. This is what it should look like. Now we're going to connect some lines from outside of here to here, and the same thing on both sides, and then we are going to use the jigsaw to cut a nice slot in there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is just cut that out on both sides. Now that we've got those slots cut out, the featherboard is finished. We may have to clearance these slots just a little bit for our hold down bolts, and that's what we're going to talk about now. These are elevator bolts that I picked up at the hardware store, a couple of washers, and some through type thumb nuts, and all in all this was $10.58, so not bad. However, they're just a little bit too big to fit into my miter slots. On my right angle grinder, I'm going to use a flap disc and just kind of take a little bit off of one edge of both of these until they just slide in there. As you can see, I just barely had to take a little bit off of each one to get them to fit into the slot very nicely. So now we're ready to mount it down, but first we need to check the clearance on these. And I've already noticed that I'm a little bit tight down here. So I've got some 60 grit wrapped around a paint stick, and we are going to just kind of stick that in there and get these things sliding around in here real good. Elevator bolts, washers, thumb nuts are installed. They're not tightened down, just to see kind of how it's going to sit into the miter slot. Gives you the ability to move it around, to move it in and out. And this is why I like to kind of do these slots way up like this, is so that I can pull it back and I can utilize that and get the widest piece of wood in there possible and still have the fingers against it. I have the other fingerboard I'm going to cut in a few minutes in there, and as you can see, we'll just push it right up there real nice and just tighten it down. And there we have it. You can go through and clean some of this up if you want, but you don't really have to. It doesn't affect the functionality of this any whatsoever. It's got this board pinned in there pretty nice and snug. It will hold it tight against the fence as it goes through, and it doesn't want to allow it to slide backwards, which is good, so that helps to prevent some kickback. The next featherboard we're going to make, we're not going to cut any of these slots in it because we're just going to clamp it. So it's just going to get measured 3 inches back, the same as this one, and the fingers cut in it. I've done the same thing. I've drawn my line across 3 inches down from both sides, and now I'm just going to start cutting in my fingers. Here's both our feather boards complete. I have one here that had a small knot. It's probably going to break off. No big deal. There's plenty of others there. However, in some instances, like I had some knots right here, and I had one here. This one's no big deal, but this one, that one's probably going to break off also because of that knot. So if you can find areas that are more clear, like I may have been better off working off of this side. There's one little knot right there, and I don't know, maybe the same thing here. Just shorten them up or picked an area where I could get no knots. So now what we're going to do is get the sacrificial fence installed, get these clamped into place, and show you how they work. Here's what both feather boards look like installed. And I'm just using the bar clamps to hold this other feather board to my sacrificial fence. It is also adjustable front to back depending on how high the blade is. I have the blade dropped all the way down right now because I just wanted to show you that the board will slide forward very easy. It's tight to the table. There's a little bit of wiggle there, not much. You cannot pull the board out backwards. I am tugging on it pretty good. You cannot pull the board out backwards. This makes cutting thin strips of wood extremely safe. You will not have to worry about them getting kicked out of the saw, and not that you do most of the time anyway, but I think the biggest danger, in my opinion, with a table saw is cutting those thin strips. That's when the material can bind up, funny things can happen, and they can leave the saw in a hurry. So these feather boards are all about being safe, creating the inward pressure that you need against a fence to get a nice straight cut, and creating the downward pressure that you need to hold this material in place while it's being cut. So guys, always respect the power of your power tools and stay safe. That's all we got for this time, guys. And remember, you can always go buy these, but why would you? You can make them yourself, a couple of hours, and take a little pride in them. They won't last forever, but they'll last long enough. They'll keep you safe, and they're easy to make out of some scrap wood. If you enjoyed yourself, click on one of those two videos. They're going to pop up right there, and we'll see you soon.